She passed away, surrounded by her family, but the man holding her hand was a complete stranger to them all. When the truth came to light, a heavy silence fell over the room. Machines beeped softly as sunlight streamed through the half-open curtains, casting gentle shadows across the floor. Bouquets of flowers, sent by colleagues, neighbors, and friends, lined the windowsill. At Sophie's bedside sat a man with tired eyes but a steady, unwavering presence. His name was David. His fingers gently curled around hers, his thumb tracing small circles across the back of her hand. He hadn't slept in days, but the weariness on his face only revealed the depth of his love. He never glanced at the others in the room, not even when Sophie's brother cleared his throat awkwardly near the door. He stayed beside her, whispering gentle words to her, even though she could no longer respond. "You were so brave," he murmured, "even when they didn't understand." Especially when they didn't understand. Across the room, Sophie's family sat, distant and stiff. Her mother, Margaret, wore pearls and a prim bun, her posture perfect, her face pale but unreadable. The tension in the room was palpable. Sophie's father, Daniel, stood near the window, arms crossed, staring out at the parking lot, lost in his thoughts. A nurse entered quietly, checking the IV, nodding politely at David. "Mr. Thompson, please let us know if you need anything," the nurse said, her voice soft. Margaret's eyes narrowed as she repeated the name under her breath. "Thompson?" David caught her gaze, but he didn't react. His wedding ring gleamed softly in the low light as he gently brushed a lock of Sophie's hair from her forehead. Sophie had worn hers too, though most never noticed. But today, the light caught it just right, and Margaret's frown deepened. Her hand tightened around her purse. No one ever asked who Sophie spent her holidays with, or why she never came home for the family gatherings. And Sophie had never told them. She knew better. But David was the one she'd always loved. He'd been invisible to her family for years, but now, in her final moments, he was here, fully visible. He leaned in close to her, pressing his forehead to hers, his voice barely above a whisper. "You didn't need their permission," he said softly, "and you never asked for it." The heart monitor beeped steadily, the only sound that filled the room now. Something had shifted, the atmosphere now heavier with unspoken emotions. Sophie's cousin cleared her throat, nervously checking her watch. Her aunt whispered to her, "Poor man, he must be just a friend of Sophie's." David heard them, of course. He always did, but he didn't respond. He had long ago learned that his love for Sophie didn't need validation, and certainly didn't need anyone's approval. Still, the words stung. His eyes lingered on the small photo frame tucked under Sophie's bed. He reached for it, gently pulling it out. The photo showed Sophie laughing, her head resting on his shoulder at the beach. That moment, that anniversary trip to the beach, had been the one time they didn't have to hide. But hiding had been their reality since the beginning. He remembered their wedding day. It hadn't been a grand ceremony, just the two of them in a quiet courthouse. Sophie wore a simple white dress, nervous but radiant. He wore his best suit, the only one he owned, one he had bought years ago for a job interview. Their only witnesses were two close friends who understood how rare and genuine their love was. No photos were shared online, no public announcements made. Sophie didn't want the noise. David had always accepted this. He never asked Sophie to change, never asked her to make their love public. It had been their choice, and it was enough. On Christmas Eve, when Sophie left for her family's dinner, David stayed behind. He made her favorite soup, waiting for her return. When she came back, her eyes were red, and her makeup smudged. "It wasn't the right time," she said, and he simply held her. Later, in the quiet of their apartment, he gently asked, "Do you ever wish we were just easy for them?" Sophie's response was a whisper. "They wouldn't understand. I'm protecting you." Back in the hospital room, whispers continued to fill the space. Sophie's aunt leaned toward her cousin, still gossiping. "Poor man. I guess he's just a close friend." David heard it all, but he stayed silent. He didn't need their approval. His grief didn't need their permission. And yet, it hurt. He reached down and pulled the photo frame out again, running his thumb over the glass. Sophie's smile in that picture was wide and free. The version of her no one in this room had ever seen. He remembered the day they said, "I do." It hadn't been a grand ceremony, just the two of them, alone, in a small courthouse. There were no grand speeches, no family celebrations. It was just them. Their love, quietly witnessed by two friends who knew what they had, was rare. Sophie's mother, Margaret, stepped into the room, her heels clicking sharply against the tile. Her expression was stern, her eyes cold. David remained seated, unbothered. She didn't acknowledge David. She walked straight to Sophie's bedside, turning toward the priest who was holding the Bible. "She would want a final prayer," Margaret said briskly. David stayed still, his hand still holding Sophie's, her wedding ring still catching the light. He didn't need to say anything. He knew his place. The priest began to pray softly, but the air in the room felt heavier, the tension thicker. David didn't flinch, didn't even blink. He had been in this moment with Sophie for years, in silence, in secret. Margaret's eyes flickered down to the wedding ring on Sophie's finger, and then to the small document David held in his hand. It was an advance directive. The priest paused, glancing between Margaret and David. There was confusion in his eyes. "Would you like to join us in the blessing, David?" he asked. David nodded once, a small, quiet nod. "She believed in grace," he whispered. "Let's give her that." The prayer began again, soft and steady, and as the priest recited the words, David stayed focused on Sophie's face. He whispered a prayer of his own. "You didn't need their permission," David whispered, his thumb brushing across the back of Sophie's hand. "You never asked for it." The room fell into silence again, and for the first time, Margaret looked at David, really looked at him, seeing him not just as a stranger, but as Sophie's husband. It was a small victory, but it meant everything. David didn't need her approval. Sophie had already given him that. The ceremony ended, and as the family left the room, the air seemed to shift. David stayed behind, alone with Sophie. He hadn't asked for any of this. He hadn't asked to be invisible, to hide his love for her. But he had loved her, fully, completely, and it had been enough. The funeral was held on a gray afternoon, the kind of day that pressed the silence into every corner. Sophie's family stood together under the oak trees, speaking in hushed tones. No one mentioned David. No one mentioned Sophie's husband, the man who had been by her side every step of the way. But that didn't matter to David. He had never needed their approval. Sophie had chosen him. That was enough. Later that day, Sophie's younger sister, Emily, went through the study at their parents' house. She wasn't looking for anything in particular, just trying to find something of Sophie in this place. She opened the drawer of the desk, and there it was, a small cream-colored envelope resting on top of a worn blue journal. It was addressed, "To my family. Please read after I'm gone." Emily froze for a moment, then picked up the envelope, her hands trembling. She went to the sitting room where their parents were. "What's that?" Margaret asked, her voice tight. Emily opened the letter, her voice shaking as she began to read aloud. "If you're holding this, I'm already gone. I debated writing this, but there are things I couldn't say while I was alive. Now, I don't have anything left to lose." Emily continued reading aloud, her voice soft, barely above a whisper. "You never knew David, not really. But I did. I knew every part of him. The way he held me when I was afraid. The way he listened without judgment. The way he made me feel safe in a world that told us we were wrong. You always thought I kept him away out of shame. That's not true. I kept him away because I was trying to protect him from your judgment." Emily paused for a moment, the weight of the words settling in the room. Margaret's jaw clenched, but she remained silent. Their father just stared at the table. "I didn't want the man I loved to be treated like he was less than he is," Emily read, her voice trembling. "I didn't want him to face your disapproval. But now, I have nothing to hide." Margaret closed her eyes, a tightness in her chest. She knew this was coming, but hearing it now, in Sophie's own words, felt like a punch to the gut. "I didn't tell you I was sick because I knew what would follow. Drama, control, cold comforts. Instead, I made a different choice," Emily read. "David and I were married again, in a little chapel near the lake. Just the two of us. I wore a white dress, and he cried during the vows. It was the happiest day of my life, even though I knew it would be one of my last." Margaret looked down at her hands, her fingers still clutching the tissue. Her face was pale, the lines on her forehead deepening. Their father was still silent, but his hands were shaking. Emily's voice wavered as she read the last part of the letter. "You may think David wasn't family, but he was my family. My only real family in the end. So if you still believe he was a mistake, that's fine. But know this. My final wish was to be held by him as I left this world. And he gave me that, even knowing what he would face when I was gone." Silence filled the room again. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was a moment of realization, of truth being laid bare. Emily folded the letter carefully, her hands still trembling, and placed it back on the table. No one spoke at first. It was as though the words Sophie had written had rendered them speechless. Their father cleared his throat, his voice rough. "She made her choice. And I suppose, in the end, that's what matters." Margaret didn't respond. She simply stared at the table, a single tear slipping down her cheek. Emily stood up, her heart heavy with sorrow, but also with the weight of something else, understanding. "I hope you understand now," Emily whispered. She loved him, and he loved her, without asking for anything in return. Margaret remained silent. The room grew colder as the finality of the moment set in. Sophie's love, once hidden, now stood bare for all to see. The funeral had ended. Sophie's family went their separate ways, each lost in their own thoughts. David didn't say a word. He had said everything he needed to say to Sophie, in his quiet love, in his presence beside her. Later that afternoon, David stood at Sophie's grave, his fingers brushing the cool stone. A bouquet of white peonies rested on the ground beside him. He said softly, "You always told me we'd be okay. And we are." As the sun began to set, David lingered by the grave, his eyes locked on the horizon. The world felt empty, as though all the color had drained away, leaving only shades of gray. He could still feel Sophie with him, her presence a quiet warmth in the cold evening air. He wasn't sure if it was real, or if it was just the longing he had carried all these years. "I wish you were here," he whispered, more to himself than anyone else. The words felt foreign in his mouth, but they were the truth. The sound of footsteps approaching caught his attention. He turned to see a figure moving slowly towards him, a young woman with long, dark hair and soft eyes. "David," she said softly. Her voice was familiar, yet it took him a moment to place it. It was Hannah, Sophie's younger sister, who had distanced herself from the family after Sophie's death. "I thought I might find you here," she continued, standing beside him. "It's strange, isn't it? How time doesn't really heal anything. It just changes you." David didn't respond right away. He looked at her, noticing the same sadness in her eyes that had been in Sophie's not so long ago. "Doesn't feel like it's been years," David finally said, his voice barely audible. "It feels like it's been a lifetime, like everything before is just a dream." Hannah nodded, her expression pained but resigned. "I know what you mean. I've been avoiding this place for so long. But I think I needed to come back. To find some closure, I guess." She looked at Sophie's grave, her hand reaching out to touch the cold stone. "I never got the chance to say goodbye properly. I didn't even tell her I loved her. Not in the way she needed to hear it." David could see the guilt in her eyes, and it mirrored the pain he had carried for so long. "You loved her in your own way, Hannah," he said quietly. "We all did." Hannah sniffled, her voice trembling. "I just wish I had been there for her, when she needed me." David placed a hand on her shoulder, offering a silent comfort. "She knew you loved her, even if you never said it aloud. She knew." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The wind picked up, swirling leaves around them in a quiet dance. Finally, Hannah sighed, looking back at David. "Do you think Sophie ever found peace?" David turned to face her fully, his eyes filled with a quiet understanding. "I think she did. I think she found peace when she was with David. I think she's at peace now." Hannah didn't respond, but the faintest hint of a smile played on her lips. It was a small comfort, but it was enough for that moment. As they stood there, the sky grew darker, the stars beginning to appear one by one. A new chapter had begun for them both, but it wasn't one they were ready to write just yet. The night deepened, and the only sound was the rustling of the leaves in the wind. The air had grown cooler, and David felt a sense of peace wash over him, as though the silence was a gift. "It's strange," David muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "How life keeps going, even when it feels like it's stopped for you." Hannah stood silently beside him, her eyes following his gaze toward the stars. "I know what you mean," she said softly. "It's like the world doesn't pause for your grief." David nodded slowly, his eyes still fixed on the stars. "I think that's what makes it so hard," he said. "The world keeps turning, and you're left behind, stuck in the past." Hannah glanced at him, her expression softening. "But we can move forward, David. It might not be easy, but we can choose to step out of the past. For her. For ourselves." David turned to face her, his eyes meeting hers. He could see the same longing in her, the same desire to move on, even if it felt impossible. "You're right," he said quietly, "but it feels like there's always a piece of her that's missing, no matter how much time passes." "Maybe that's the way it's supposed to be," Hannah replied, her voice thoughtful. "Maybe it's not about forgetting her. Maybe it's about carrying her with us, in our hearts." David looked down at the ground, letting the words sink in. He had never thought of it that way before, but it felt right. Sophie had always been a part of him, and perhaps always would be. As they stood there in the stillness of the night, the first stars twinkling above them, A sense of calm settled over both of them. They weren't quite ready to let go, but they were beginning to understand. "I guess it's okay to miss her," David murmured, as much to himself as to Hannah. "It's okay to still feel the pain. I just don't want to forget her." "You won't forget her," Hannah said firmly. "None of us will. Not as long as we remember her the way she truly was." David smiled, a small but genuine smile. "Thank you, Hannah." As they stood together in the fading light, David felt something shift inside him. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a spark of hope. As the days passed, David found himself slowly adjusting to life without Sophie. The silence in their apartment was deafening at first, but over time, he learned to accept it. He had always thought that grief was something that would eventually go away, that one day he would wake up and the pain would be gone. But now he understood that it wasn't that simple. The memories of Sophie were everywhere. The pictures, the little trinkets, the music they used to listen to. It all reminded him of her, but in a strange way, it was comforting. One evening, as he sat by the window looking out at the street below, his phone rang. It was Hannah. He hadn't spoken to her much since the day at the cemetery, but he always appreciated her presence. "David, I was thinking," Hannah began, her voice tentative. "Maybe we could visit the lake this weekend. It's been a while, and I think it might help you. Help both of us, really." David hesitated for a moment, unsure. He hadn't been to the lake since Sophie's passing. The thought of returning there without her felt impossible. "I don't know, Hannah," he said slowly. "It just doesn't feel right. But maybe it's time." "It's okay to not feel ready," Hannah reassured him. "But you'll never know until you try. We can go at your pace. No pressure." David took a deep breath and looked out at the horizon. Maybe Hannah was right. Maybe it was time to let go, even if it felt hard. "All right," he finally said. "Let's go." The weekend came, and as they drove toward the lake, David could feel the tension in his chest. The memories of Sophie were strong here. The way they had laughed, the way they had talked for hours. When they arrived, the lake looked as beautiful as ever, its surface shimmering in the sunlight. It was peaceful, almost like time had stood still here, just like the last time they were there. "It feels different," David murmured as they walked along the shore. "But it's not bad." "It's not supposed to be the same," Hannah said gently. "Things change, David. But that doesn't mean we can't still find peace here, in a new way." As they sat by the water, David closed his eyes and took in the familiar sounds of nature, the rustling leaves, the soft lapping of the water against the shore. He felt a slight release, like a weight lifting. "I think I'm ready now," he said quietly, "to start living again." Hannah smiled softly. "You don't have to do it alone, David." They stayed there for a while, not talking, just being present. For the first time in a long while, David felt something that resembled peace, and it was enough. The weeks that followed were a blur of small steps forward. David found himself embracing the quiet moments, the ones where he could simply sit with his thoughts without the overwhelming grief. One afternoon, he found himself at the park, watching children play on the swings. It was a familiar scene, but it felt different now. It felt like the world was moving on, even if he wasn't sure if he could. He sat down on a bench, his thoughts drifting as he watched the sun sink lower in the sky. The park was quiet, save for the occasional sound of footsteps or laughter. "Hey, you okay?" A voice broke through his reverie. He turned to see Hannah sitting beside him, her face soft with concern. "Yeah," David said, offering a small smile. Just thinking. I get it, Hannah replied. Sometimes the silence is the hardest part. David nodded, his eyes fixed on the horizon. It's like I'm stuck in between two worlds, the one where Sophie was still here, and the one I have to learn to live in without her. You're not stuck, David, Hannah said softly. You're just finding your way. And that's okay. They sat there in silence for a while, the weight of words unspoken hanging between them. But it was a comfortable silence, the kind that felt like understanding without needing to say anything. As the sun dipped below the horizon, David felt something inside him shift. Maybe it was the quiet support of his friends, or maybe it was the slow process of healing. Either way, he knew he wasn't alone. Thank you for being here, Hannah, David said, his voice sincere. I'm not sure what I would have done without you. Hannah smiled, her eyes soft with warmth. I'll always be here, David, no matter what. As they stood up to leave, David felt a small but significant shift inside him. The weight of the past was still there, but it didn't define him anymore. He could feel the first stirrings of hope. Let's go get some coffee, Hannah suggested. I think we both deserve a break. David nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Sounds good. As they walked towards the cafe, David realized that even though the pain would never fully go away, he didn't have to face it alone. And that, in itself, was enough for now.